Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to talk about the peculiar sleep habits of the Vikings, those famous Norse seafarers known for raiding monasteries and, apparently, having very specific ideas about bedtime. So, let's dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to set a relaxing vibe, and begin our journey for today. Imagine a cold night in the 9th century, in the wild lands of Scandinavia. The biting wind blows through the cracks of a Viking longhouse, where dozens of warriors, women, and children huddle around a central fire, struggling against the darkness. The smell of wood smoke mixes with the scent of unwashed bodies and animal pelts. Welcome to the world of Viking sleep, a universe where sleeping wasn't just about rest, but a true art of survival. Have you ever wondered how the famous Norse seafarers managed to rest between epic battles and maritime expeditions that lasted for months? Get ready for a journey into the strangest and most ingenious sleep habits in medieval history. Tonight, we'll discover that the Vikings had sleeping methods that would make any modern person question everything they know about a good night's sleep. The communal hall, what it was like to sleep with 50 strangers. The Vikings lived in communal houses called longhouses, structures that could house anywhere from 20 to 50 people. Imagine trying to sleep in a college dormitory, but multiply that by 10 and add some war axes hanging on the walls. Privacy was a completely foreign concept to them. Everyone slept in a single long room, sharing the space with family members, servants, slaves, and even their pets. Yes, you heard that right. Pigs, chickens, and goats often slept in the same area as the humans. It wasn't exactly out of love for animals, but because the body heat of all living beings helped keep the temperature bearable during the brutal winters that could last up to 6 months. The strange sleep hierarchy. Here's where it gets interesting. There was a strict hierarchy to determine who slept where. The Jarl, chief, and his family occupied the area closest to the central fire, while the slaves slept at the colder ends of the house. It was like a social class system based on BTU. The more experienced warriors had the privilege of sleeping on beds, which were actually just wooden platforms covered with bear or wolf pelts. The less fortunate slept directly on the dirt floor, using straw as a mattress. And when we say straw, we're not talking about those romantic hay beds from movies. We're talking about straw that was often infested with fleas, lice, and other small unwanted companions. The Viking night ritual. Before going to sleep, the Vikings had specific rituals that would make any modern skincare routine seem simple. First, they checked their weapons, because you never knew when an enemy might attack during the night. Axes and swords were kept within arm's reach, turning every hour of sleep into an armed vigil. Then came the stories. The skalds, Viking poets, recited epic sagas that could last for hours. Imagine trying to fall asleep while someone narrates in detail how Ragnar Lothbrok destroyed his enemies with a giant serpent. It was like having a medieval podcast, but with no option to pause or skip episodes. The issue of nighttime hygiene. Here we need to talk about one, let's say, aromatic aspect of Viking life. Prepare yourself for an olfactory journey that will make you deeply appreciate your modern bathroom. Bathing was a nearly mystical event in Viking society. It happened perhaps once a week, if they were lucky. The bedtime routine didn't include teeth brushing. Toothpaste wouldn't be invented until the 18th century. Hand washing, there was definitely no change of clothes. The Vikings literally slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, for days, sometimes weeks at a time. Imagine the smell. A complex blend of accumulated sweat, wood smoke that permeated everything, dried blood from battles or hunts, rancid fish oil used to waterproof clothes, animal hides at various stages of tanning, and the natural scent of bodies that didn't know deodorant. It was like a medieval survival perfume, intense, memorable, and definitely unforgettable. But here's where it gets interesting. The Vikings developed an impressive tolerance for these odors. For them, this aromatic bouquet was simply the smell of life. In fact, there is historical evidence that they purposely used the strong scent as a form of psychological intimidation against enemies. It was an olfactory war. I can sleep in this smell. Can you fight it? The situation got even more intense during the winter months, when the longhouses were sealed against the cold. Without proper ventilation, the smells concentrated and intensified. Chroniclers of the time described entering a Viking house as being hit by a wall of smells. It wasn't a metaphorical wall. The most surprising part is that the Vikings had a hierarchy even for basic hygiene. The jarls, chiefs, had more frequent access to hot water and had rudimentary soaps made of ashes and animal fat. Slaves, on the other hand, could go for months without any kind of personal cleaning. Imagine the olfactory difference between the two extremes of the social scale on a cold winter night. And what about their hair? The Vikings were surprisingly vain about their hair and beards, but care didn't necessarily mean cleanliness. They used fish oils and bear fat to keep their hair shiny and protected from the cold, creating a distinctive look that came with an equally distinctive scent. Curiously, despite all this olfactory reality, the Vikings had strict rules about who could share sleeping space with whom, partially based on smell. Some odors were considered more noble than others. The smell of a warrior returning from battle was more respected than the smell of someone who worked with leather tanning, for example. Sleeping at sea. When they were on maritime expeditions, Viking sleep habits became even more extreme. On their long ships, the space was so limited that the warriors literally slept on top of each other, like Viking sardines. They took turns sleeping, and often slept tied to the ship, to avoid being thrown overboard during storms. One particularly curious practice was sleep sailing. Some specialized Vikings were able to sleep while rowing, developing a kind of body autopilot. It was like sleepwalking, but with oars and out at sea. Definitely not recommended for beginners. Dreams and superstitions. The Vikings took their dreams very seriously. They believed that dreams were messages from the gods, or visions of the future. There were even specialized dream interpreters who analyzed the dreams of warriors before battles. If a Viking dreamt of ravens, it was considered a good omen from Odin. Dreaming of wolves could mean that Fenrir was sending a message. But if someone dreamed of fish, well, that usually meant it was time to check if the previous night's dinner was still fresh. The art of sharing skins. One of the most underrated skills in Viking society was the art of sharing animal skins as blankets. It wasn't just a matter of everyone grabs a piece. There was a complex etiquette about who could share with whom, based on social status, family relationships, and even battle achievements. Warriors who had fought together often shared skins, creating a kind of knightly brotherhood. It was like having roommates, but your roommates had axes and epic stories to tell. The night diet. What they ate before sleeping. The Vikings had nighttime eating habits that would give any modern nutritionist nightmares. But surprisingly, they worked perfectly for their Arctic survival needs. The last meal of the day was a complex science, disguised as culinary barbarism. It always started with fermented porridge, not the sweet porridge you might imagine, but a thick mixture of barley or oats that had fermented for days, creating a sour and slightly alcoholic taste. This porridge served a dual purpose. It provided slow-release carbohydrates to keep the body energized during the cold night, and the fermentation process created probiotics that aided digestion. Next came the dried fish, cod, herring, or salmon, that had been cured in salt and Arctic wind for months. Imagine chewing something with the texture of salted leather, but that provided essential proteins and omega-3 fats. The Vikings unknowingly discovered that these fats helped regulate sleep cycles and kept the brain functioning during the long, dark winters. But the star of the nighttime meal was mjöd, fermented mead, which was much more than an alcoholic beverage. It was a complex medicinal potion. The Vikings added specific herbs to the fermented honey. Valerian for relaxation, wild chamomile to soothe the stomach, and sometimes even small amounts of hallucinogenic mushrooms to facilitate prophetic dreams. It was like drinking a medieval pharmaceutical cocktail. A fascinating discovery is that they strictly avoided fresh meat before sleep. It wasn't for digestive reasons, but for spiritual ones. They believed that freshly slaughtered meat stirred the spirits and interfered with their ability to receive messages from the gods through dreams. Instead, they preferred dried or cured meat, which they considered spiritually neutral. The Vikings also had the peculiar habit of eating small amounts of pure fat before sleeping, seal, bear, or whale fat. To our modern palates, this would be absolutely repulsive, but scientifically it makes perfect sense. The fat provided dense calories that the body burned slowly during the night, keeping the body temperature stable in environments where the temperature could drop to 40 degrees C. A particularly curious practice was the reverse dinner during maritime expeditions. On ships, they ate the main meal in the morning and only light snacks at night, usually slowly chewed dried fish and small sips of water mixed with honey. This avoided seasickness during sleep in rough seas and reduced the need to urinate during the night. A tricky thing on a crowded ship. For children, there was a specific nighttime diet. Sweet porridge mixed with goat's milk and honey, sometimes with small pieces of dried fruits or nuts. But here's the interesting detail. This children's snack was often the only sweet meal a Viking child received during the entire week. It was a special moment that associated sleep with pleasure and safety. The Vikings also practiced what we would now call intermittent fasting without knowing it. During certain times of the year, especially at the end of winter when provisions ran low, they deliberately ate very little before sleeping, forcing the body to burn stored fat overnight. They discovered that this not only helped them survive with less food, but also resulted in more vivid dreams, something they greatly valued. And what about drinks? Besides mead, they consumed a strange infusion made from fermented birch bark, which had anti-inflammatory properties and helped with joint pain, common among warriors who spent days rowing or fighting. The taste was described as sweet wood with a touch of earth, not exactly appetizing, but functionally effective. The night guardians. Watch shifts. In every communal house, there was always someone awake during the night. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The Vikings developed a complex system of watch shifts that functioned like a human clock. Each person had a specific period to stay awake, watching the fire, listening for suspicious sounds, and protecting the community. The night guardians had an almost mystical role. They were responsible for interpreting the sounds of the night, distinguishing between the howl of the wind and possible threats. They developed such sharp hearing that they could identify different types of danger just by sound. It was like having a medieval security system, but based entirely on extraordinary human skills. Viking children. Learning to sleep like warriors. Viking children didn't have soft cribs or lullabies. From a very young age, they learned to sleep under the same extreme conditions as the adults. This wasn't cruelty, it was preparation for the life that awaited them. Curiously, Viking children were known to sleep deeply, even in conditions that would keep modern adults awake for days. They developed an impressive ability to fall asleep anywhere, on rocking ships, during storms, or even when heated arguments were happening around them. It was as if they had a natural superpower for deep sleep. Viking women and their night secrets. Viking women had their own sleep rituals that significantly differed from those of the men. They often gathered in small groups inside the communal house, creating sleep circles where they shared not only body heat, but also knowledge about medicinal herbs, family stories, and survival techniques. One particularly fascinating practice was therapeutic sleep. Older women would use specific combinations of burned herbs to help others sleep better or have clearer dreams. They were essentially the first sleep therapists in history, using methods that today would be considered advanced aromatherapy. Humor and mystery. But perhaps the funniest aspect of Viking sleep habits was the snoring. With dozens of people sleeping in a confined space, the collective snoring was described by some chroniclers of the time as the roar of sleeping dragons. There was even a superstition that loud snoring protected against evil spirits, which was convenient, as there wasn't much they could do about it anyway. And here's a mystery that still intrigues historians. How exactly did the Vikings manage to wake up at the right time without alarm clocks? Some researchers suggest that they developed an extremely accurate biological clock, synchronized with the cycles of the moon and stars. Others theorize that the roosters who slept with them, remember, acted as natural alarm clocks. The dark side of Viking sleep. Not everything was adventure and camaraderie. The reality is that many Vikings suffered from chronic insomnia, especially during the long Arctic winters when the sun barely appeared. Seasonal depression was common, and some warriors developed what we would today call PTSD after particularly brutal battles. They dealt with this through a combination of alcohol, lots of alcohol, religious rituals, and, curiously, storytelling. The sagas weren't just entertainment, they were a form of collective therapy where traumas were processed through epic narratives. The spirits of the night, superstitions and fears. The Vikings believed that the night was inhabited by supernatural creatures that could interfere with sleep. Draugrs, Viking undead, dark elves, and other mystical beings were considered real threats during the hours of darkness. To protect themselves, they developed elaborate rituals before sleeping. Amulets were placed under straw pillows, specific runes were carved into wood near the beds, and certain protective words were whispered before falling asleep. The most curious thing is that these rituals actually worked, not because they drove away spirits, but because they created a psychological sense of security that made relaxation easier. Viking sleep medicine, herbs and potions. Long before modern medicine discovered melatonin, the Vikings had already developed impressive knowledge about plants that affected sleep, knowledge that was part science, part magic, and completely fascinating. The Viking healers, known as vulva, women, or men, were the first sleep doctors in history. They maintained secret medicinal herb gardens and new recipes passed down through generations, some so ancient that their origins were lost in the mists of time. Valerian was the absolute star of the Viking sleep pharmacy. They called it the sleep root of the gods, and believed Odin had personally planted the first seeds in Middle-earth. The preparation was an elaborate ritual. The roots were harvested only during the new moon, dried in the smoke of sacred oak wood, and then ground with specific stones that had been blessed by the elements. The result was a powder that, mixed with warm mud, could make even the most restless warrior fall into a deep sleep. But Valerian was just the beginning. For more complex cases, the healers created personalized dream potions that would sound like medieval witchcraft recipes, because they basically were. For warriors returning from battles with what we would now call PTSD, they mixed wild chamomile, which grew abundantly in the Scandinavian fields, with small amounts of Arctic poppy. This combination not only induced sleep, but also reduced violent nightmares. One of the most intriguing recipes was the prophetic dream drink, a complex mixture that included Amanita muscaria, the red mushroom with white spots from fairy tales, which they called Odin's mushroom, in very small and carefully controlled doses. This mushroom induced extremely vivid dreams that the Vikings interpreted as divine messages. It was dangerous. A wrong dose could be fatal, but the most experienced healers knew exactly how much to use. For specific problems, there were specific solutions. Children who had night terrors were given a gentle infusion of linden and honey, heated with hot stones and administered in small animal horns, which worked as medieval baby bottles. Pregnant women suffering from insomnia received raspberry leaf tea mixed with warm goat's milk. Elderly people with joint pain that hindered sleep were treated with herbal baths before bed. They would boil willow bark, which contains substances similar to aspirin, and pour the aromatic water into wooden... The most sophisticated were the dream pouches, small leather bags filled with dried herbs that were placed under the straw pillows. Each pouch was customized for anxious warriors, wild lavender and rosemary; for women with menstrual cramps, wormwood and fennel; for fearful children, chamomile and dried wild rose petals. The aroma released slowly during the night worked as a primitive form of aromatherapy. A particularly fascinating practice was the use of dream smoke. On special occasions, the healers burned specific combinations of herbs in special braziers near the sleeping areas. For important rituals, they used a mixture of juniper, sage, and a mysterious herb they called Freya's grass, which modern historians believe was wild cannabis. The smoke created an altered state of consciousness that facilitated both relaxation and vivid dream. The Vikings also discovered something that modern science confirms. Timing was crucial. They administered their potions at specific times related to the lunar cycles and the seasons. During the Arctic winter, when seasonal depression was common, They increased the doses of solar herbs like St. John's wort, which they believed captured and stored the light of the summer sun. For extreme cases, warriors who hadn't slept for days after traumatic battles, there was the temporary forgetting potion. This mixture included larger amounts of poppy, concentrated valerian, and a herb they called silence grass. Possibly mandrake. It was so potent that it could make someone sleep for up to 3 consecutive days, waking only for basic needs. It was risky, but sometimes necessary to break severe cycles of traumatic insomnia. The knowledge was passed down through a complex system of apprentices, and each healer kept some recipes as personal secrets. Some formulas were considered so powerful that they could only be taught to blood relatives or in situations of extreme need. It was like having a highly specialized medieval pharmacy, where each prescription was a personalized work of art. The seasons and their challenges. Summer without night, winter without day. Perhaps the greatest challenge for Viking sleep was dealing with the seasonal extremes of Scandinavia. During the summer, when the sun barely set, they had to create artificial night by using thick skins to block the light. In winter, when darkness ruled for months, the challenge was maintaining energy and spirits. They developed fascinating techniques to cope with these extremes. In summer, they created social sleep schedules where the whole community collectively decided when it would be night, regardless of the sun. In winter, they deliberately extended nighttime activities around the fire, turning forced darkness into quality community time. The Elder Vikings, nighttime wisdom. The older Vikings held a special place in the community's nighttime hierarchy. They often suffered from joint pain and other health issues that made sleep difficult. But in return, they offered something valuable: knowledge. It was common for the elderly to stay awake longer, sharing stories, advice, and observations about weather patterns. They became like living libraries of the community, available during the long nights to pass on knowledge accumulated over decades. Their insomnia transformed into a community service, creating a network of nighttime wisdom that benefited the entire Viking society. Conclusion and reflection. Looking at the Viking sleep habits, we realize that sleep was much more than rest. It was survival, connection with the community, and keeping traditions alive. They turned the basic need for sleep into a complex communal experience, full of rituals, hierarchies, and deep meanings. While we complain about our mattress not being comfortable enough or our room being too warm, the Vikings remind us that sleep can be an adventure in itself. They slept under conditions we would consider impossible, but they created a rich culture around this basic necessity. What can we learn from them? Perhaps that sleep doesn't need to be perfect to be restorative. Maybe that sharing stories before sleep creates bonds stronger than any modern social network. Or maybe that, in the end, a little historical perspective can help us appreciate our warm bed and quiet room. Interactive closing. Now tell me, after learning about the Viking sleep habits, do you still complain about your pillow? If you were a Viking, which aspect of medieval nighttime life do you think would be the hardest to adapt to? Sleeping with 50 strangers, sharing space with animals, or perhaps having to keep a weapon always within reach? Leave your answer in the comments, and let's find out together if you have what it takes to survive a Viking night. And the next time you snuggle into your bed, remember, you're sleeping better than Viking kings ever did. Sweet dreams. No ravens or wolves, we hope.